My name is Kent Harris, and I've been a member of the Board of Directors of Riverscape for about 12 years. It's been my distinct pleasure to have served during the administrations of John Muchner, Charlie Williams, and now Michael Shaw. As a member of the old guard, I continue to be amazed at what this organization has been able to accomplish almost without any fanfare at all. I believe that 2021 is going to be recorded as one of the better years we've had. Some of this year's accomplishments include the pedestrian connector between the river and Dewey Point here. We had a nice camp for children. We had a very successful Moonlight on the Wabash Gala. Had a very successful Explorer Wabashiki. And now we have this Smithsonian exhibition and a local exhibition on the history of mussels and the industry in Indiana. And the speaker series is part of that, which runs through January 2. We'll complete this program, as I say, on January 2. If you haven't done so, go to the exhibition at the new Vigo County School Corporation headquarters, which is a repurposing of an elementary school which was closed last year. Pick up one of these and use them, get $1 off on other museums in town, collaborative effort we have there, because at least 3 of the 5 museums have something, an art show at the museum, historical perspective at the History Museum, and hands-on things for children to do at the Children's Museum. So take advantage of that too. Now my main reason here today is to introduce our speaker for the day, and he is going to introduce members of his family and a co-speaker and tomorrow night's speaker. Wayne Padgett is professor of electrical and computer engineering at Rose-Hulman. He has helped develop a course on appropriate technology and work with an indigenous village to improve the water system. He has an ongoing research project to explore the performance of an off-grid Biosand filter system. He has a master's degree and PhD from Georgia Institute of Technology and a bachelor's degree from Auburn University. I present Professor Wayne Padgett. Go Eagles.
Thank you.
If you would introduce the other people and the family members, we'd sure appreciate it.
All right, I can do that. He asked me to mention my family a little bit because my wife is here. Tommy's in the back there. And my son is a student at Rose-Hulman Institute of Science, and my daughter was actually involved in this project in an indirect way. She was the motivation for us going to Panama, where I got involved with a small village there that needed work on a water system as well. So she's in Boston in graduate school right now. And Michelle Rinsel-Payne is a collaborator on the course that we developed together. She'll be talking about that in a minute. And so I asked her to be part of it because she's actually contributed a great deal to both the project that we've used the filter for in the class and the development of the class as well. In fact, a number of the things that I'll tell you tonight I learned from Michelle. So, so she's a water expert and I'm an electrical engineer. Anyway, so that's the introduction slide there. This is Michelle Rinsel-Payne again. And she was involved in the initial development of the course that that I'll be talking about some tonight, along with Andy Mack, if some of you know him. He's a retired Rose-Hulman mechanical engineering professor, and Roger Ward, who's a Rose graduate who does a lot of water consulting and also some Engineers Without Borders work with with the Rose group and others. And so was there anybody else involved? I think that's everybody that we had originally in the development of the class. Okay, so I will let Michelle talk a little bit about the beginnings of the course, and then I'll talk more about the filter part.
All right, well, thank you for having us. Since this project is centered around a course that Wayne had the idea for, and he's going to talk about the genesis of how he came up with, developed this idea, and then we developed this course with that group of collaborators. We wanted to share some of the learning objectives that we had as we were developing this course that really led into this larger project and platform that we're going to share tonight. So we wanted students to be able to describe and be able to affect problems in the developing world. And we wanted them to not only just be aware of issues and maybe some potential technologies, but how do we actually be able to analyze the appropriateness? Because it's really important to make sure that your technology is appropriate. We can have the fanciest new gizmo, but if it can't be maintained and sustained and used, if it ultimately isn't of interest for that community, it's worse in many cases than even doing nothing. And so we wanted students to be able to analyze the appropriateness, it doesn't quite show, of those technologies, and then be able to explain. We had what we called, I'm forgetting the term, on Fridays, Do No Harm Fridays. And so every Friday, we would provide case studies and the students would analyze those. We also wanted students to be able to actually design something with the constraints that might exist as much as we could emulate for developing communities. We wanted students to be able to have a budget and only access to materials and tools and labor that might exist in those communities that Wayne's going to describe when he talks next here. So students did build this filter that you see, and that was after multiple iterations of the course when we kind of settled on this larger project that Wayne will discuss. Now, this didn't happen just with the four of us chatting. Wayne did a lot of surveying of existing organizations out there, and we learned a lot by leaning on other experts in this area of community development. We, like Wayne mentioned, we have an alumnus from Rose-Hulman, Roger Ward. He does a lot of work in EWB, the Engineers Without Borders group, professionally, and in mentoring multiple schools in Indiana. He's an excellent resource. And with that and other resources, we were able to develop this course. Now, just to kind of set some context and motivation for why we thought this topic was important in addition to Wayne's experiences. And I want to note that sanitation is purposefully put first on this slide. It's really important to recognize that sanitation, while we take it for granted, is not universal. And there's a lot of need for sanitation. It is potentially more important than clean water. You just think of clean water as being the first thing that developing communities need. They do need clean water. They also need to have access to sanitation. And poor sanitation can contaminate otherwise clean water for folks. Diarrhea diseases are one of the leading reasons that women and girls have to drop out of, or that, let me back up, are the leading reason that for some of the leading reasons for infant mortality in developing communities. Having to get water, having to have access, having to take the time to get access to that clean water is one of the leading reasons that women and girls are taken out of school, that can't complete their schooling. And so in terms of economics, having access to sanitation and clean water is critical. And in fact, the UN Sustainable Development Goals list water and sanitation together as one of their, it's actually number 6 of their 2030 development goals, because they're so interlinked and we can't forget about one when we're addressing the other. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it back over to Wayne, and he's going to talk about the crux of the course and your experiences that led to all of that, what we've been working on.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. So one of the things that became clear as we looked at the question of what kinds of technology would be appropriate in developing communities, it's very common in the kinds of communities we're talking about to have very minimal infrastructure. So you see minimal access to sanitary toilets. That's one of the first things that's very difficult to have access to. Achieving a clean, reliable water source. A lot of times people are working with surface water sources that are not treated in any way. Most places like that also don't have electricity, and because you're talking about places that are inexpensive to live for most of the people that are in these places, it's often a place where the transportation is very poor, and that's why it's not very expensive to live there. So you wind up with places where it may take you 2 hours to get there in an off-road vehicle because the roads are just not very good to get to a place like that. That's a very common situation. Now, I also wanted to point out that when I talk about developing communities, I tend to think of, and I think most people tend to think of, places where you have to take an airplane to some country that's, in Africa, South America, Asia, far away, right? And a lot of those places do exist where there are people with very low incomes in the order of $1 a day in some places. But that's not a thing that it is absent in the United States, right? So it's worth pointing out that there are homeless populations here along the Wabash River in some cases. You can read stories about places, homeless camps along the river, under bridges and places that people have gone, and they go there because they're not very accessible, and they're places that they won't be bothered, right? That people won't come and find them. Kind of similar reasons to what you see in other developing areas. There are economically distressed areas in the U.S. There are places, a number of places. Flint, Michigan comes to mind, some recent stories where they had lead in their water because of some poor choices that were made about how to handle their water treatment. But that came along with economic distress, right? So that's a fairly common thing. And I think we're all familiar with some of the weather disasters and things that have happened where large cities were basically without power for days and weeks. The Katrina was a few years ago. Puerto Rico was hit with a very serious storm, and there were people there without water for months. So these things can happen here as well as in faraway places, right? So the beginning of the story for me, being interested in the course, being interested in water technology, because again, my background is actually electrical engineering. So I never took a course in water treatment, and unless you count what I've learned from Michelle, right, as a course. But I had an opportunity to take a trip to Panama. This is something my daughter was interested in doing. And while I was there, I got invited to visit a village, and I had been asking myself, well, what can engineers do in a place like this that would improve the situation? What kinds of things are needs, right? And so that's my training. My training is we solve problems, right? So I was looking for, well, what is a problem that I could help solve in this village? And so this is Panama down there right on the edge of South America, right, Colombia. And this is another interesting thing about how this works. There was a political fight over the land in Panama, whether it was Colombia or whether it was independent. You cannot drive from the United States to South America. You can drive from the United States to Panama, but there's a place called the Darien Gap, which is between Panama and Colombia, and they basically said, when they were separated, the Colombians were angry about that, and so there are no roads. They're building roads there. So you can't get to Colombia unless you walk through the woods, right? From Panama. But this is the whole area. It's only about 13 miles across there at the narrow part between the Panama Canal runs from Panama City over to Colón. So I knew a guy from Panama once, and he said one of their favorite things to do was to go swimming in Panama City in the Pacific Ocean, and then drive over to Colón in the afternoon and go swimming in the Atlantic Ocean. So that's but Panama was a had a large U.S. military base. The canal is there. The canal zone was a big economic driver for Panama even now. We turned it over during the Carter administration to the Panamanians, and so they run that. But that part of Panama is very well developed. And then there's a lot of areas outside of that corridor that are really much less developed. So the village that I got invited, we were staying in Panama City, and I got invited to go visit this village, which is at the end of a lake. I'll show you. So here's Panama City, and the Tocumen Airport is where the international airport comes in, and the canal zone is right along here. And you can easily drive out very close to the Imra Village. Imra is a native language group of indigenous people there in Panama. There's about 5 different language groups. They consider themselves different tribes of Indians, if you want, for indigenous groups. But Imra is one of them. And this village that I got to visit has a tourist business. Right? They actually bring, when cruise ships come through the Panama Canal, they'll bring people out to their village and show them handmade artifacts and traditional dances and teach them a little bit of history and that sort of thing. But you get there by traveling up this lake in a dugout canoe with an outboard motor. Okay? So you drive on the nice road right up to the edge of the lake, which Salamanca is the meeting point here, and then you ride the dugout canoe all the way across the lake and then up the river to visit the village. So they are actually in a wilderness area. They're not allowed to do a lot of development there because they're protecting the watershed for the lake, which the lake drives the canal. The actual locks in the canal are all gravity fed. So if the lakes were to not supply enough water, then they would not be able to operate the canal, which is one of the main economic drivers in Panama. So that's a big deal. So that's why they live out there. And they live out there also because as an indigenous group, they have a lot of culture and traditions around how to live. They live in the same way out there as people lived out there 1,000 years ago. They live in raised huts, and and they know what you can eat, what you can't eat out in the jungle, right? And so this is a diagram of the village that was prepared by a Peace Corps worker who was in the village. And that on the left is a picture of me standing in the river with Max, who was in charge of operating their water filter system as it was designed by the Peace Corps. So you can see the village and all of the houses here. This is actually the top of a hill. And there's a water system and tank and filter here, and then the water line runs down through the village for people to have access to. It doesn't go to every house. But it's delivered from a stream bed across the river and up a large hill. And they have a little dam on this stream bed here, and then the water ends up crossing the river in this pipe from 2 treetops over to the top of the hill above the village, okay, which seems very circuitous to me when I first saw it, but they're right next to a river, right? So why are they getting water from a mile away in a stream bed? Anybody have a good idea? Not Michelle.
Not drinkable.
The water in the river is far more contaminated than what's in the stream bed across the way. And it's still above the village, and so they're able to gravity feed it down. So for both reasons, they used a bunch of PVC pipe to get that down there. And I'll tell you, it's a long walk. Right, we went up to see the dam. That was an athletic event for me. So that's the state of the original system that I got to see when I first went there. This is the water filter that the Peace Corps built, and they had it full of sand. It's designed to backwash. So they actually feed it from the bottom, and the water comes out the top. And when they want to wash it out, they can change the valves and drain the water backward through the sand to clean it out. So that's the way it was designed. Well, it got clogged up with too much silt and organic matter, and so they took the sand out of it. And that was fine because the water was relatively clean where they were getting it from until they had a dry season and a rainy season. In Panama, they don't have summer and winter. They're essentially on the equator, and so they get dry season and rainy season. And so they had dry season and a lot of waste and debris collected, and then they had rainy season and it all washed into their water system, and a lot of people got sick. And then they said, oh, well, we really need a better filter, right? So, but then the Peace Corps was not there. No one was available to reinstitute the sand and refill the filter and set it back up again. And so when I got there, they were working on improving that system, and they asked me, well, you know, can you help us with the water filter? And I said, well, I can try, right? I can find out something about that. And I actually was able to get the plan that I showed you from the Peace Corps worker, Kevin Bingley, who was back in the United States working for the Army Corps of Engineers now. So I was able to get that for him and find out how it was intended to work. And later on, they decided to rebuild the filter. And so this system is, it was in construction while it was there. This inner box is the new filter, and the outer box is the new storage tank. So they actually built a concrete storage tank with a filter built into it, and that's where the pipe is going to come, or does come now, for their current filter system. And we helped help them pick out the rocks and sand that were needed to set up and operate the filter.
That filter box was on the receiving end in the village, right?
Yes. Yeah. This, if you look back here, right, the dam is here. They had a storage tank and a filter box here. That's the old filter box, and they moved the new one up the hill from there, and it combined the storage and the filter. How big is the filter?
How big is the village?
I believe it's written down there. There were about 25 households in there. Most of them have children, right? And given their economic circumstances, the government has built a school in the village, and to go to high school, they have to leave that village and live in another village because it's too far away. But the vast majority of the children learn to read and write and move to a city where they can get a better job. Most of the people that are adults in the village do not read and write. So, and that limits their economic opportunities pretty significantly. So you can see that because they have a tourist business, they wear traditional clothes when people from outside the village are there. I actually saw some people coming and going when we weren't there, and they were wearing t-shirts and shorts. Right? But they have a rule that you wear the traditional costumes when there are visitors, because that's where a lot of their economic input comes from. And so one of the things that we learned in looking into humanitarian work is that there are a great number of wonderful opportunities to do humanitarian work where the results are much less than what you would hope for, okay? And one of the main reasons is when somebody from the US goes to a place where there's very little economic activity and very few resources, the people there tend to be glad that you're going to come and glad that you're going to do something, and no matter what you say, they will say, yeah, we want you to do that. Right? So it's very easy to be fooled into thinking that they do want what you think that they need, even if when you leave, they're going to go, well, okay, I guess that was a bust, but we're glad they came. Right? So you get that sort of problem a lot. And so communication is very difficult. And as you might imagine, it's not that easy to communicate with people whose background, circumstances, life history, traditions, language are all different from yours. It's quite a difficult thing to cross that barrier in a short period of time, which is most Western humanitarian work. People are there for a very short period of time, right? You don't go there and live for 2 or 3 years, unless you're in the Peace Corps, maybe. And so it presents a real difficulty. This is an example of a case study where a professor was working with a village and was interested in, as Dr. Mitchell said, that the sanitation is an important health intervention in a lot of places. And so this professor that wanted to do a humanitarian project said, well, we think a toilet would be a good thing. The people in the village had a really different idea, and in this case they were willing to say so. They said, well, you know, a community toilet means that somebody's got to clean up after everybody else, so who's going to do that? Which is a great question. Okay, and then she said, well, toilets are a good idea. What if, you know, there was one toilet for several houses? What about that? And they said, no, that's not a great idea culturally. We just wouldn't do that. Okay, right? And it turned out in this particular case study that they ended up building an electric windmill because the people in the village were upset about hydroelectric dams that had been established by the government and wiped out large areas of land and moved a bunch of villagers out. And they didn't want that to happen to them. And so they were interested in demonstrating the benefits of a windmill because that wouldn't require them to move out of their home. Okay, so they weren't excited about the toilets. And the proverb, the stranger's eyes are wide open, but he does not see anything, to basically just a reminder that when you visit a place and you don't know what they hold as their priorities, you can misinterpret almost everything. And so it's a very powerful thing. And we try to teach that a lot in the class. That's when we were talking about the Do No Harm Fridays. We basically try to hit a case study every week of the course to let people see that going into a place and having a good idea and wanting to do something helpful can actually make things worse in many cases. There's a really well-documented case where people say, well, we're going to collect clothing for people and we're going to give away free clothing. So, well, the people who were selling clothing before you came and gave away free clothing, that was really bad for them. And after you leave and those people go out of business, then now there's not only not any clothes, there's also no one who sells clothes. Right? So you can make things worse by trying to do something helpful. And unfortunately, that's pretty common. So, so because this village in Panama asked for help with their water system, we decided that a water system would be a good focus for the course that we developed as a design project for the students. And Michelle was earlier saying that we were looking for constraints on that project for the students to use materials that would be available internationally all over the world, and low-tech technology and labor, which the students were generally not experts in water system or plumbing or electrical or whatever, but they had some background, some technical background. And so we actually they designed a system, and different parts of the class took pieces of that. And we had them screen the sand in much the same way that you saw what we did in Panama. They actually pulled all that sand out of the river and then they screened it. And we had our students do the same thing. You screen for different sizes so that you can have the fine sand on top and then larger and larger grain sizes down towards the bottom. And that way the fine sand won't actually get pulled through the filter. You can only step up the size a little bit at a time, basically double the grain size as you go down in layers. And then by the time you're done, you can have, big rocks because powers of 2 go really fast. Okay.
That picture local?
That picture is on Rose-Hulman's campus. This pond is behind Jess Lucas's old house, if that means anything to you. Right across from where the bonfire is, near the observatory. There's a sustainability garden, and there's a pond there. He said it used to be Jess Lucas's backyard. There's a little island with a bridge on it that's all overgrown now. But we put the filter there because that's a good example. Like I said, there's many places where a village has access to clean water, or to some water, and it's a groundwater source. It's a pool, puddle, creek, lake, or whatever, and there's no electricity. So those were basically the constraints that they operated under. They have this system has a small solar panel, about 2 feet by 4 feet, and it's driving electricity there to a small pump that's in the water, and that pumps the water up into the upper tank so that the rest of the system can be gravity fed. So that was our biofilter system that the students designed. Like I said, that was sort of in the midst of construction. They have a bunch of different grain sizes of gravel and sand and so forth, and they use a baby pool to get the water because it's a lot easier to screen the sand when it's wet. Right? So, and the design was to deliver about 285 liters of water per day. So that was enough for about 5 or 10 people. So basically a household-sized system. So that's more of a schematic diagram that shows the idea of having a solar panel. We had a battery and controller there so that we could operate the system even into the evening, right? And it works well in the summer. In the winter, we close it down because it's too cold. But the pump is actually a submersible pump that feeds the upper storage tank, and we use a very small opening in the pipe to deliver water slowly to the sand filter. Now the sand filter is more than just a sand filter. Sand is a very common filter medium in the United States even. The water treatment plant here probably has a sand filter as part of the treatment that they do for the water. But this is a little bit different from that because it's actually designed to carry a little water layer above the sand filter. And because it filters through slowly, what you would expect is that some organic, various kinds of bacteria grow along the top of that filter. We call that the biolayer. There's a German word for that called Schmutzdeck, which basically means slime. Right, the slime layer. And it turns out the bacteria that grow there will eat the bacteria that will make you sick. So the bacteria that make you sick are typically E. coli, or coliform bacteria. And the word coliform there comes from the root word colon, right? So every kind of warm-blooded animal that lives in the woods has that kind of bacteria in their digestive tract. So do you. But that will make you sick. Those kind of bacteria like to live in your digestive tract. And so we want to get most of that out. And any kind of surface water source is going to have that kind of contamination. The river would be full of that, right? The stream will have some, right? Because there's animals playing in the water wherever you go. So we want to get a lot of that coliform bacteria out, and the sand won't really do that. It helps. It'll get a lot of the turbidity out, which is small organic particles that carry a lot of bacteria, but it won't remove the bacteria so well. But the biolayer will. And this is actually a filter design. If you just took this filter here, there's a lot of work that's been done. COST is one of the sponsor or the source information organizations we talked about. They have a design plan for building a filter like this where you're expected to bring your water, pour it in on the top, and then wait for it to filter through and catch it in a bucket on the other side. And that's a design that's been used in a lot of places on a sort of household basis. Okay, now this design was intended to work continuously, right? So hopefully be able to deliver a lot more water. We have a second, a first storage tank that is designed as a diffuser where we could add chlorine, because if you did reduce the coliform bacteria and there was still a little bit left, you'd want to treat it with chlorine to clean that up. And then the final output would be a place where you could store up water, and so you don't have to stand there and wait for it to drip out, right? But you could then fill up your water container from there. So that was the design that the students, with some advice and help, came up with. And our goal was basically to build that and have the students learn something about what was possible, and then also use that as something that we could study the practicality of and examine what the weaknesses and strengths of that design would be. So we've been operating that filter for 4 or 5 years now, and studying various kinds of improvements possible effects that we might be able to do with that. And this is some of the data that we were able to take. So if you look here, you can see this is turbidity over time, and you can see the turbidity is a great deal lower. There's the pond water and then the filtered water. So the pond water is typically a lot more turbid. The filtered water is far less. Turbidity is just the cloudiness of the water, right? And and then over here you have the coliform count along with the temperature. This coliform like warm weather, right? They like your digestive tract ideally, so warm weather is good for them. So they were happy in the warm weather, and then they were somewhat less abundant even in the pond in the cooler weather. But you can see that the pond coliform count is this gray line. The filter coliform count is this black triangle. As you can see that the coliform was considerably reduced, and on a percentage basis, you can also see that initially the filter did not reduce the coliform count very much at all. But after just a few weeks of the opportunity, we actually bleached it at the beginning, so it killed everything. And it doesn't remove coliform, and then when the biolayer grows and forms a good organic filter, we get better than 90% reduction of coliform. So that was so it did actually do what we thought it would do, and so we were pleased about that. We were able to show that part of it was very effective, and also got a little bit of a measurement of how long it took for what they call ripening for the biological layer to grow. Okay.
You have to seed that bacteria then?
No, the bacteria all live in the pond. And the conditions in the filter are such that the coliform bacteria don't do well, and the right kind of bacteria at that top layer where there's oxygen do quite well. So there's actually some bacterial action at the top layer, and then there's also anaerobic bacteria activity down in the sand where there's not oxygen. And in both cases, other types of bacteria thrive there besides the E. coli, and so they turn out to be food for all the other kind of bacteria. Right? So you're basically creating the right kind of environment for the right kind of bacteria, right? So this, the purpose of the course, again, was to give our students a project so that they could learn something about what was possible to build in the conditions that exist in developing communities. It turned out we got a lot of opportunities to improve the filter and to have various kinds of independent study projects. So other students outside of our class got opportunities to develop various other improvements to the system. I had a Internet of Things class project to work on taking data with a data radio to monitor the solar panel and the battery status and the pump operation. I had another student that worked on developing a tipping bucket water meter that could report the flow rate out of the filter. And that still hasn't gotten completely working. I'm still trying to get that integrated into the filter. We had a student do her master's thesis on measuring the types of bacteria that are effective and growing inside the Biosand filter. So I actually did some DNA analysis on the types of bacteria to identify what kind of bacteria are the good kind, okay? So there's been a number of research projects and different faculty. We've had statistics faculty involved with this, and microbiology, as well as the environmental and water research. So we've had a number of different learning opportunities out of just operating the filter and measuring its performance. One of the things that we've worked on is measuring or developing the electronics to one of the goals that I had was to find out how long does a battery last, right? If we're cycling that battery up and down every day, how long before you need to replace one? Right? Because if we were going to build one of these in a village, it would be really helpful to be able to say, well, if you have a battery, you're going to expect to replace that battery once a year, or once every 2 years, once every 10 years. You know, what does it take? So I really wanted to get some data that showed, you know, how much sunlight do we get, how long did the pump run, how much energy do we get out of the battery, and how long did it last? So we designed an electronic system. Well, the original goal, or the initial, let me follow my slide. The initial goal was reliable pump control so that the water storage would stay full and that we could use the battery and the solar panel effectively. The other goal was to record that data and actually put a radio there that would transmit data back to my office where it could be stored on the internet and I could check on the pump filter without having to walk down there, okay? So those are the main goals, and we don't have a full year of data about the battery quality yet because this is hard. Okay, so the initial version was the students designed something with a float switch. It was a very heavy duty float switch, but we couldn't get it inside the tank, and it didn't, it had too much friction and it wouldn't switch very, very effectively. So that would have been good for keeping the tank full, but it wasn't very effective for our other purposes anyway. So I had an Internet of Things class that designed a little microcontroller system with a long-range radio, data radio on it, and that actually mostly worked, but they had a problem with the radio transmitter code, and I had our ECE technician fix that, and we got that working. But we had some problems with the switches. We put little float sensors in there that had very tiny switches in there, and it turns out a very tiny switch will, with just a little bit too much current, will actually weld the contacts together if you don't design it just right. And so I was having to replace the switches several times a year. So we went, and he was enthusiastic about it and designed a whole new board with a very different kind of sensing circuit. And that's what's in there now, but I found out with that new circuit that during the summer, that electronics box sitting out in the sun gets too hot, and it made that microprocessor fail. So next iteration, I think it's going to have an umbrella for a sunshade over the top of it. And maybe I'll get a whole year's worth of data. But this is the kind of thing that you don't want to experiment with in Panama, right? And so it's a wonderful opportunity to learn some of these lessons right here in Terre Haute, where it's convenient to get the tools to do the swap out. There were a lot of things that we've learned about the pump and filter system, and a lot of it turns out to be plumbing related, really. It turns out that we used a gate valve initially to be able to turn down the flow rate to be really small. Well, the gate valve has got a screw and a gate, right, that you can push down to a very, very tiny tolerance. And it turns out if you put that in the sun and then at night, the thermal expansion will move the gate and turn it off, right? And so we would adjust it to the right flow rate and then come back a few days later and it would be not running. And we'd adjust the flow rate and come back a few days later, it would not be running. So we replaced that with just a hole. We found the right size hole, and those don't vary so much, but they do get plugged up. So we had to have a way to backwash the hole. We found that when you pump water up into a tank like that, you need to have a vent opening of some kind so that the thing won't siphon, because we had a float valve that would turn the pump on and off, and it would pump water in and turn off the float, and then it would siphon water back out and turn the float on, and then turn on the pump, and it would just sit there and oscillate all day if you don't break the suction. Each of the tanks, if the water flows in there and you let the water just overflow, the area around that pond is very low lying, and it just turns into a marsh all the way around the filter, and they weren't able to mow the grass around it because it was overflowing and pumping enough water out on the ground. And so I had to add overflow hoses back to the pond for the places that could overflow. And it turns out those will airlock. If you have just a hose with the water level that gets up to the top and it goes down, and if it dips any at all, then there will be a little bit of water in the hose and no water will go into the hose because there's no back pressure. And so you have to vent the top of that hose so that water will dribble down the hose and actually finally build up enough head to push it out into the pond. So again, I learned a lot about plumbing. I've replaced the pump 5 times, I think. So I'm looking for a better pump that would work better. It turns out that pond has an artificial dam which leaked and the water level went down. And one of the reasons we've had to replace the pump so many times is because the pump sits in the mud and it's pulling too much mud because the pond isn't as full as it used to be. We haven't developed a chlorinator that we like. That we'd like to build a chlorinator that would sort of self-meter. So when the water's flowing, that it would add chlorine, and when the water's not flowing, it wouldn't. Because if you add too much chlorine, nobody wants to drink that. And if you don't add any chlorine, well then you haven't reduced the bacteria any. And I mentioned the electronics overheating as well. But my point in making the slide of all the things that we learned is we learned things that we didn't give a project to somebody in a developing area to depend on that doesn't work. We learn things that don't work, and we're engineers, so we're going to look at solving those problems and coming up with an answer that's a good answer before we propose for somebody to go out and use it, right? So hopefully after a few years, we'll be able to operate this thing reliably, and then we can say, well, we know this works. So that's one of the goals for developing that design. Just a reminder, sustainability, people talk about sustainability a lot, and to me, sustainability means all of these things, right? Economic stability, that is, people can afford it and are willing to pay for it, right? That's a big deal. If people say, well, that's a great thing, but well, if it breaks, we can't afford to fix it, well, that's a problem, okay? There's environmental sustainability, that you don't want to make the water dirtier or ruin the environment, like my overflow did, made a marsh around the filter, made it worse in some ways. And then there's the social case. That is, you don't want to create a situation where people are unhappy that this happened, right? There have been cases where somebody said, well, we're gonna put in new pipes to all the houses. Well, it turned out most of the social activity in a village happened where people were gathering around the well, and now they have their water in their houses and they don't come outside, right? We have that here. We have called air conditioning. Right? Right? So, you can do social or cause a social problem out of those things. And so, again, understanding the community, their priorities, and what their perception of what the needs are and what the best solutions are is a critical part that often gets ignored, especially by people whose focus is technical. And I don't know anybody like that. Right? So it's a real issue, and it's an issue for almost every kind of humanitarian project, is that Americans, Western culture, we tend to focus on how can we succeed quickly, and we don't focus on what are the relationships, what are the priorities of the people that we're trying to help, right? And so it's really easy to say, well, we came and we saw and we conquered and we're gone. And that often completely neglects the social pillar of a humanitarian project. So that's my last slide. I've learned a lot. I think my students have learned a lot. I think different independent study groups at Rose-Hulman and some other faculty have had opportunities to learn a lot from operating the filter demonstrator, because it's an off-grid developing countries project. It's not an expensive thing to maintain and operate. It doesn't cost a lot of money. I can do that for less than my son spends on Starbucks, right? So, I won't even mention what my daughter spends on Starbucks, right? So we've all, I think, learned a lot. Like I said, I think one of the biggest things that I gained from running the course and from examining these things is that good intentions and technical background are not enough to make a successful humanitarian project. I can name for you 5 or 6 examples of humanitarian projects that made things worse by people with good intentions and appropriate technical knowledge, but they did not engage the community in what they were doing, right? So that is a critical element. It's necessary to have those things, but it's not sufficient. And communication is a big piece of that. So I think one of the funnest things about this class is that it has both a technical component and what I would say is a humanities component of trying to engage the students and thinking about what are the cultural, what are the communication, what are the human issues. And I like to point that out with the picture there of, are you worried about the filter or are you worried about the people, right? That's the bottom line in what we're talking about. So, do you have any questions? Yes.
Who is the intermediary in this project? Peace Corps, the government? How'd you find this project in Panama?
That's a great question. My daughter's motivation was she wanted to participate in a mission trip, which is why I went to Panama. And so the intermediary was the missionaries that were requested somebody to come and teach English there in Panama as a part of their program. And the missionary who had been working in this village was the one who invited me out to visit the village with him. And so every time I visited that village, I've gone with the missionaries there in Panama who have a contact there and various people in the village. And they actually, it turns out, this is one of the funny things about a developing area, they don't have a great clean water source. They don't have a great sanitation system. They all have cell phones. Okay? Because that's economically important and socially important. And they have solar panels that they can charge their cell phones off of. And so the missionary there is able to call and text people in the village. And there's
Even though they have to climb a tree. To get
if they want a reliable signal, one of the guys in the village will schedule a time and he will go to the top of the hill and climb a tree so that he can get a good signal from the tower there. So yeah, that's my intermediary. I think it would have been a very short and unproductive visit if I had gone by myself because they speak Spanish and I don't. And we actually have a video of a conversation I had with one of the leaders in the village with the missionary as an intermediate. And after I showed this video 2 or 3 times, one of the students in our class was a fluent Spanish speaker, and she said, "Do you know he's not translating what you say?" And I said, "No, I didn't know that." And so when I was asking questions, the missionary was explaining to the leader in the village, well, this guy has these kind of ideas about what's going on, and these are the kind of answers that are probably going to be effective for you to give. And then he would say, okay, well, I would say this, and then he would translate that. So there was actually a lot of context and explanation going on in Spanish that I was not aware of. I still haven't got a transcript of that conversation, but it's a lot more interesting than I thought it was, yes.
Is there an on-site manager of that system?
There is. I told you Max was the village leader who was in charge of the water system. And he actually has done some repair work on different things. He actually, he showed me one of the modifications that he made to that new system that solved one of their problems with overpressure. They get some water hammer effect when they turn it off because there's a lot of air in the line. And I think they actually have a crack in the line that's letting more air in the line. But yeah, the Peace Corps basically said to them, you have to assign somebody to be in charge of maintaining and operating the filter system. And in most places like this, a sustainable model is that either somebody gets paid to do that or they rotate that responsibility around so that it's not just all on one person to do all the work. But that's one of the things that you have to consider is if you go to a village and say, we want to help you with a water system, there are ongoing maintenance concerns, and it would be a foolish thing to say, well, I hope you figure that out, right? Instead of saying, well, what would your plan be for managing the maintenance of this? What's fair, right? Because after a year, somebody's going to say, I'm tired of that, right? So you need a plan. Yes?
Oh, well, I'm not an engineer, but just watching this, isn't the biology of it pretty much the same as a fish filter in a fish tank?
It is very similar to that in the sense that you're having various kinds of organic waste and bacteria pulled in there, and then hopefully you have the right sorts of bacteria growing, and you have to wait for it to ripen, right? So there are a lot of similarities. Biologically, I don't know if it's the same bacteria at all, but the principle is very similar, yeah.
So the pictures that you showed of the new system in Panama, you did that before starting this project?
I think those were separated by about a year. I did the first visit where the older system was actually still in operation before we developed the class. I actually did some work on developing the class, and we went back and helped with the development of the water. So yeah, I think it was. I think they actually built the new system before we were offering the class. I think that's right, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah.
You hadn't done any iterations yet before the new system was built?
Right. Right. No, this was an experimental effort. After we ran the class, we thought, well, we'd have done actually several different projects around pumping and different things, and we decided that, you know, this would be a really interesting project to do, and we divided the class up to do different parts of it. And since then, we've basically done the class on some aspect of improving it, typically. Have different groups work on improving the chlorinator design or some other component of that.
Plan to take the ultimate results of all of this work back out to that field location?
I don't think this filter is going to go to that village because that village has a gravity-fed source. They don't need a solar panel and they don't need a battery. The biofilter part, they're getting some natural effect of that, although their filter probably has a higher flow rate than what this would. So I don't know that they're going to get all the benefit of the biological component. They also should be able to get chlorine from the government, although they tell me that they can't get it. I'm not sure they would use it if they did get it because it doesn't taste good. And if they don't see people getting sick, then they're a lot less likely to worry about it. But I think a filter like this would be very valuable in a place where you don't get a gravity-fed water system. And I've seen a number of examples of places where people are taking water out of what looks to me like a mud puddle, right, or a river or a lake, and both of those tend to be pretty concentrated, contaminated sources, and so you could improve that a great deal, and have the water waiting for somebody as opposed to them having to go fish it out next to the cattle in the river or whatever. So yeah, that's. In my mind, this design is something that would be appropriate for a place where people are working directly out of a contaminated ground source. And there's lots of those, just not this village. Yes?
How large a community is that practical for?
Well, at the rate that we're talking about, I think you'd be talking about 10 or 15 people would be enough. And it depends on whether you want clean water for people to cook and wash and bathe in, or if you want clean drinking water. Because a lot of times people can use less clean water to cook because you're raising the temperature and boiling it and you're getting the bacteria out that way. So it just depends on what you reserve that water for. Like I said, you could reasonably do 10 or 15 people that way. There's nothing about that system that would prevent you from doing it in parallel. That is, you could add capacity by bigger solar panels, a bigger pump, and more filter cross-section area. So you could have 3 sand barrels in that system, and a bigger pump, and you could deliver a lot more water. And like I said, there's nothing about that system that doesn't scale really. And those 55-gallon drums are actually pretty common and pretty easy to obtain in most developing areas as well. Yes.
These are all appropriate for tropical or temperate regions then?
Well, we shut it down in the winter here because it freezes, right? I don't know how many developing communities are living in places where it gets below freezing on a regular basis. Obtaining water then becomes a much different question, right? If you have to melt it. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that, although I do know there are places. I mean, the man who developed the system in that village, Kevin Bingley, was working in Alaska with the Corps of Engineers with the Indian Affairs of whatever, I can remember the agency's name is. So there are developing communities of indigenous people in places where it gets really, really cold. But yeah, this would not be a great design for that. One of the things that happened to me repeatedly in Panama is we would drive by a house and you would see the pipes coming out of the floor and then going into the ground. And I would drive by that and think, oh, those people are just gonna break in the winter. It's like, in Panama, it's not gonna happen. They don't have that problem. But you know, it made me do a double take repeatedly. In fact, when they built that concrete enclosure, I was horrified because what they did is they cleared a flat place on the ground, they built the block structure, and then they poured concrete inside for the floor. Well, if you did that here, the first frost would heave the floor up and bend the thing, and it would break all the seals, and that would never work. Here, you have to lay a pad, you're trying to dig it down below the frost line, and I'm doing civil engineering stuff now. And you put the block on top of the pad, and you put rebar in between, and then nothing moves, right? But they don't have frost heave, so that's not a problem. I asked one of the missionaries about that, and they were like, oh yeah, people do that here all the time. It's like, okay. But it's like, it's not the same world that we have to deal with here. And like I said, I cover this thing up and put antifreeze in it every winter, so that it won't get destroyed by the winter.
Are you going back
to Panama?
Yeah.
I probably will at some point to see what the current situation is. The last time I was there, they were having a problem. Like I said, I think they had a crack in the feed line, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how would you locate that crack, and I never came up with a great answer to that. And I don't know what their current situation is. I haven't been in communication with them lately, but I would like to go back and visit that area. I might actually end up in Ghana before that, because our church just sponsored the drilling of some wells in the northern part of Ghana, and they've expressed interest in me going to look at that just because they know I've thought about it. Not because I'm an expert in wells.
Don't you have their cell phone number?
I do not. That would be an international call. But and I couldn't talk to them anyway because they don't speak English. But I do have the phone number and the email address of the missionary there that if I want to get something, although we experienced, this is something I experimented with. I wanted to know what's the flow rate of that water filter system that they had before. How many gallons per minute are they getting from that? Well, you should try to explain to a missionary in English something that you have a technical question about that he's going to translate to Spanish and ask somebody with no technical background to go measure. I still don't know.
Now, you were there, you've been there once or twice?
Twice.
Twice?
Mm-hmm.
How many days at a time?
The first time I just visited for one afternoon. When we went back to work on their water system and help with that, we spent about a week there. And we basically go there and spend the night in the village and come back and go back to the hotel and then go back out for another couple of nights. And yeah, I think we spent just a little over a week working with them and helping figure out what kind of sand, and we built the screen boxes and we helped them screen the sand, and we talked to them about chlorinating the water, sanitizing the sand so that it would be not contaminated from the bottom of the river. And so those sorts of things. And then I went back, and one other time actually I went back and visited and talked to them a little bit about what other kinds of projects they'd be interested in, but I haven't gotten to go back since then.
How did they sanitize the sand? Did they put it out in the sun or what?
They actually used Clorox. They have, I mentioned that they don't have good sanitation. They have pit toilets there, mainly for the visitors, and they don't have any kind of treatment for that, and so they pour Clorox in them to keep them from smelling bad. That's what they do. Yes?
And you can only visit certain times of the year because they have the rainy season and
right?
That's right. There are certain times of the year that it's not good to go there because the river's too low, and other times when the river's too high. So you have to kind of catch the right season to be able to go there, or else it's a little bit dangerous to travel the river. So.
Is there alternatives to chlorine?
There are a number of alternatives. Chlorine is awfully easy to get in developing areas, but there are, and actually Michelle probably could answer that question a lot better than I could about what kinds of things are being used.
Do you mean for the pit toilet or do you mean for the water disinfection?
For the filter system.
The filter system. Well, I mean, UV light is an alternative that is used in the US, but you still have to add chlorine because you have to have disinfectant in the distribution system. And UV light is only, there's no residual for UV light. Those are the most common too. You can use ozone, but again, there's no residual. So you would still have to add in the US, you still have to have a disinfectant that is present to the last customer on the line. Yeah, chlorine is just so easy to get and ubiquitous that it is the most. It also, compared to some of the other options, like you could add fluoride. Sorry, I'm looking at what it is, but it has the least disinfection byproducts for the benefit that you're getting. And so it is a very effective, least negative health impactful disinfectant. Nowadays, a lot of times we'll use what's called combined chlorine, which is chlorine plus ammonia. And that's actually what Terre Haute uses, the Indian American water uses. And so it takes longer time or more disinfectant to achieve the same disinfecting power. But the reason for switching to that is there are less disinfection byproducts. There are other downsides and whatever, to evaluate that system. But chlorine is just universal. It's effective and it has lower disinfection byproducts than some of the other options.
One of the interesting techniques that I've seen is a stand next to a well or other water source that allows people to meter a small amount of chlorine into there. That's typically a 5-gallon bucket or a jug, jerry can, whatever they call it, where you fill up your bucket of water and then you can meter a little bit of chlorine into it. And for pennies a day, literally, you can basically have a locking container you can drop a jug of chlorine into, and then they turn a knob, kind of like a gumball machine, and it meters out the right amount of chlorine for a 5-gallon jug. And that's one type of health intervention that people use to help people ensure that their water is disinfected.
Roger Ward on this trip?
Roger Ward did not go to Panama with me. He's been to at least 5 or 6 other places that we've talked about, and probably more than I've talked to him about. Yes?
In a household system with a well, you have, I sort of understand, you use like a filter after the chlorinator to take out the chlorine smell, like a carbon filter or, I don't know, charcoal inside or some other medium. There's something like that in there. Could they do that so that they were more apt to use the chlorine? And I think you said that people don't like the taste of the chlorine, so they avoid it sometimes. Is that something that would be a possibility?
I haven't heard anybody propose that, but I don't see why that wouldn't be an effective way. It's a little bit tricky because it's hard to get good hygiene behavior with people that haven't got a tradition for that. One of the things that you see, I told you about the idea of just the sand filter, where you pour water in and then you collect the water coming out. Well, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to figure out that some people, when they have that filter, will go collect dirty water in a jug, pour it into the filter, and then use the dirty water jug to collect the water out of the filter, which defeats a lot of the purpose, right? And so if you've got people doing that, running it through a carbon filter, the carbon filter itself doesn't remove bacteria, and in fact can grow bacteria. With the chlorine coming in, that helps, right? But it's removing a lot of the chlorine and some of the taste, but you wonder if you're not creating a problem that you didn't have before, where you get dechlorinated water, which now is easier to contaminate and can grow things once you've removed the chlorine. So I think the answer is yes, you could do that. I'm not sure you would get the result you wanted if you did.
The permit might be more difficult to access and procure.
Yeah, the cost would be probably an issue as well, right? So it's not a terribly expensive thing, but it might be hard to get, and it would definitely raise the cost. And then, like I said, you have to change it out so that you don't get bacteria growing in there. And there's several elements to that. But yeah, that would be a great example of the kind of thing where you have to look at that and say, well, I think this is a good idea. Will the people who you're talking about helping, will they think it's a good idea? Will they prioritize it? Will they use it the way it has to be used in order to be beneficial? And then you kind of have to answer all of those questions yes for it to be what you would consider a good application. So it's not that looks good to me, let's do it kind of a question, right? It takes communication, right, to even know whether that's a good idea or not. Yes, sir.
Could you share the value of the departmental technicians in your interdisciplinary team? As part one of the question, and two, what kind of growth do you see on the part of the students between the freshman design and the senior design?
Well, I told you that our ECE technician has contributed to this substantially. He's done probably as much work as I have in doing the design work and the software for the radio system there, and helping the students fix the systems that they did that didn't work. There's other technicians that have helped considerably in the process, but I haven't been the one to drive that. Michelle might be able to talk about some of the other contributions, just running the labs and that sort of thing that we do with our students. But so yeah, the technicians are invaluable, right? They know how to work all that equipment, and they have all the resources. So as far as freshmen to seniors, one of the things that we did with this course is we put a prerequisite on it for Calc 3 so that we wouldn't get a lot of freshmen coming into the class, because we didn't want to have a technical prerequisite. We wanted people from most majors to be able to take it. But we didn't want people that hadn't really gotten any technical background in any area yet. So we were basically trying to push the bottom level up just a little. And it turns out we mostly get seniors because they're the ones looking for a good humanities elective that sounds interesting, right? So we got a lot of seniors in there. And yeah, the freshmen, some of them have a lot of experience with physical construction of things. All of the seniors have some, or nearly all the seniors, have some background because they've been in a lot of labs and they've been asked to do projects and they've used the resources at Rose, and they have a lot more familiarity with what's doable. So we get a lot more capability to go build something from the seniors than we do from the freshmen. But the freshmen often have some ability to do that sort of thing. So it's wildly varying with freshmen. It's pretty consistent with seniors.
Is the Engineers Without Borders a program that's academically driven? College campuses, how many chapters of Engineers Without Borders are there? Or are they chaptered, or how are you organized?
Well, I don't run Engineers Without Borders. I just know the people that do. My guess from hearing them talk is that there's probably about 300 or so chapters of Engineers Without Borders. That's just a wild guess, really, in the U.S. And they are typically, I mean, it's an engineer-student organization. So it would typically be at a school with an engineering department, and probably a civil environmental engineering, most likely, because a lot of their projects are water and sanitation for reasons that we've talked about, bridges as well. So a lot of that draws out of the civil engineering program. And it's really it's a program that encourages and gives opportunities to students to take what they're learning about and apply it in a service organization. So the name tells you a lot, right? That Doctors Without Borders is basically an opportunity for doctors to go do humanitarian work, right? And this is an opportunity for typically engineering students to go and do humanitarian work. Didn't the founder come and talk at Rose-Hulman? Or was that a video presentation? I've heard him speak, I think. Was it?
Maybe I just missed it.
Oh, that
It's
might.
out of University of Colorado Boulder, I think is where it started though.
Yeah, I can't remember the guy's name. But yeah, I've heard him speak. And that's basically what the purpose of the organization is, to give people an opportunity to do engineering students primarily, and to encourage that sort of in professionally long term as well.
I want to correct myself. It's iodine would be the other alternative. I was just thinking of the periodic table. I thought of the wrong thing, so I just wanted to correct myself. So iodine, if you've ever gone backpacking and you use an iodine tablet and purify your water, it's okay. You wouldn't want to do it every day, right? Because there's more disinfection byproducts that are generated.
It tastes really bad too.
Yeah.
They use bromine in pools,
Yeah,
right? Chlorine and bromine.
Also higher.
Yeah. Okay. Well,